So I'm stuck waiting for a train. So I'll talk about something that I have been meaning to get around to making a video about because I think it is relevant and timely, and I just want it to be in the conversation. I want you to consider this. So over the last, 2 weeks, I've seen Disclosure Day, the new Spielberg film, and Supergirl. And I've also read a lot of criticism. I've seen the videos people are making where they're reviewing them, listen to the podcast that I listen to where they're criticizing them. And there's something that I think folks are missing, or at least ought to consider. These movies are not my favorite films in the history of film. Like, neither one is making my top 10. But I want to make a defense of both as a pair. You'll remember a couple of years ago we had Barbenheimer, right? Oppenheimer and Barbie came out. I've got my Barbenheimer shirt on. I love this shirt. You guys ever think about dying? Those movies together had a different kind of meaning. And so I think it's worth thinking about what these two movies say about the zeitgeist when they are coming out at the same time. And so that's what this video is going to be about. What do these say about us because of their concurrence? And the train just passed, so I'll continue this when I get home. So one of the principles that I learned over time, which I think is really valuable when you're analyzing any particular kind of art, is the principle that we presume intentionality. And the reason for that is whether you are looking at a poem or a painting or a play or a major motion picture, you could look at that and say, these actors, these directors, these writers, they didn't make these choices on purpose. It was coincidence, right? It was an accident. They just happened to make this statement. And that always could be true. But if you're doing that, if you're saying, I think it's a coincidence that these two lines in this poem rhymed, the poet didn't think of that, then you can't analyze the choice anymore. So the only way to really have an interesting discussion about the choices is to presume the choices were on purpose. And of course, we never know that to be the case, but that is what we presume. So, presuming intentionality, when we're thinking about these two films coming out at the same time, it's important to remember that in this case, that couldn't have been intentional on the part of the screenwriters, on the part of the director. That's a decision that's made by a marketing department, right? These two separate works of art we can judge based on their intentionality, but the fact that they are concurrent, that is not up to the people who are making them. That being said, if they are referencing something similar, then that is meaningful, because that is about speaking to the zeitgeist, the feeling of the audience. And we know that these artists are concerned about that. Now, part of that is they want to sell tickets, right? They want you to go see their movies. And that's not bad. There's nothing wrong with wanting to have an audience for your work. But hopefully they respect that audience. And I used to teach creative writing students about this. I think this is a really important thing to learn as an artist of any kind. If you're going to be making a piece of work, you want to respect the viewers, for example, of this. Like, I am speaking to you because I respect you. I would not, I wouldn't bother. And I used to say to my creative writing students, if you don't respect the reader, if you're not concerned with the reader's experience of the text, you're not trying to make it enjoyable or meaningful or powerful for them, then keep a diary. Right? The only reason to engage is because you want to be in conversation with somebody you respect. So let's presume, again, that these directors, producers, actors care about the audience, not just as people who will fork over $17, $20, whatever our ticket costs, obscene amount that a ticket costs nowadays, but that they care about the person's experience seeing that film. And so, and we know this to be true, at least of Spielberg, because of his track record, right? For example, I used to teach a class called Science Fiction Lit. And in Sci-Fi Lit, I had a whole unit about Mars, and specifically War of the Worlds was one of the texts. And so when we would read that, we would read it, we would, do the radio drama from the 50s, we would look at some other versions, and then we'd watch Spielberg's version of the film, which came out in 2004. When that original novel came out, 1899, I believe, it was written in 1898, H.G. Wells was speaking about British imperialism, right? He is talking to his audience about, hey, the British Empire is going around and it is conquering, large swaths of Africa, Asia, Australia, and treating the people there horribly, as though they're disposable. How would it feel if that were us, right? If some other power came in and did that to us. And so he was very much speaking to his audience. So why would Spielberg go back to that same text in 2004? Well, that film, which I encourage you to go back and rewatch in the context of recognizing, that movie is a 9/11 movie. And once you realize it's a 9/11 movie, it's doing some really interesting things. For example, unlike the novel, where the aliens come down in spaceships, they're actually shot out of cannons in these cylinders, right? Because the tech of 1898, that's what H.G. Wells could envision. In the Spielberg version, they ride the lightning, so they come down in these storms, into these giant ships that are already underground. Well, what does that mean, right? Well, Spielberg is saying, hey, terrorism is something that comes from the outside. We have, international terrorism, and also is rooted here, right? It is, we recently had the Oklahoma City bombing, right? That the roots of that violence are already embedded in our soil, right? That's a powerful statement to make with aliens, right? And there are a whole lot of other things that you'll notice when you recognize that that is a 9/11 movie. So let's get back further, right, to the 1970s. In the 70s, Spielberg makes Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And Disclosure Day is a sequel. And, I say this, boldly, right? It absolutely is. If you see the footage, this is not, I don't want to get too spoilery, but some of the kind of found footage that is revealed in that story is footage from Close Encounters of the Third Kind. So what Spielberg is telling you is these exist in the same universe. It's just that 40 years later, 50 years later, we're now at a different point in kind of human history in relation to the aliens. Again, I don't want to give away too much, but those of you who have seen the trailer know Disclosure Day is the fundamental premise is about what happens when aliens come to Earth, and the question isn't, are aliens here, which is Close Encounters of the Third Kind, but that truth has been hidden from the masses by a corporation that is making a ton of profit using their tech, right? And this person now wants to reveal that fact to the public. So we know when you see Close Encounters of the Third Kind that Spielberg is very concerned to speaking to his audience about what their era means. And Close Encounters of the Third Kind, again, worth going back, rewatching, brilliant film. And what he's doing in that one is he's talking about the kind of era of malaise. And he's using aliens not as the point, right? Although I think he's really interested in aliens, but they're not the point. He's saying, hey, what does it feel like to be in 1976, in an era where the president is getting on TV and saying, please put on a sweater and turn down your heat in the winter because we're having an energy crisis. And for people who had grown up believing in the American empire post 1950s, right? They felt like this was a period of malaise, like things aren't great, right? And so Spielberg is talking about this sense that America had at the time that things just weren't great. What if we could find meaning from the outside? What if we could have some kind of spiritual reckoning that wasn't actually religiously connected? Instead, it was, finding a purpose in a different way than at your local mosque or synagogue or church or whatever, right? So what if aliens came and that was our purpose, right? A shared purpose that we could discover. And he was speaking to that need, that desire that Americans had for a sense of meaning. So he comes back to this in AI, this idea of, aliens again play a role in AI. I don't know if it counts as spoilers. That's a film that's, 20 years old now. But again, in that one, the aliens come in and provide this kind of outside perspective on artificiality, on what does it mean to be truly sentient. So this is a well that Spielberg has gone back to before. So now he's going back to it in the present day, but in a very different way. And at the same time, we have Supergirl. Now, the criticism of Supergirl, any criticism of Supergirl, needs to be couched in understanding that a lot of the criticism of Supergirl is coming from a kind of disingenuous place, right? There's a lot of it out there that's just misogyny, right? Where, men are saying, and I don't understand why guys think this is a flex. Why would you want to go out there and, with your whole chest say, ew, girls? Like, you sound like you're 3 years old, right? But I also recognize I'm a feminist. I want to be a feminist who says men and women are equal. I actually lean toward the misandrist side. I am not a gender essentialist. I do not believe that people have intrinsic value either way based on biological characteristics. I think that's bunk. These are cultural constructions. But if I have to lean one direction or another, I kind of always lean with the idea that social oppression actually creates strength and value in people. And so, when in doubt, kind of on average, oppressed populations end up being, for lack of a better term, better because they have dealt with things that cishet white guys don't know about. And so if I have to lean kind of either way, I'm going to say, I'm going to hedge towards misandry because women have had to deal with a lot more than men, right? In the same way that people of color have had to deal a lot more than white people, or that, people who are in the queer community have had to deal with things that a straight guy has not had to deal with. So already I admit my bias, right? If something, a piece of artwork wants to focus on a woman, a person of color, I actually think that's going to be a more interesting story than telling the story of, a cishet white guy, Rambo, running around with a machine gun in, Rambo 2, whatever. So that, to me, doesn't make me go, oh, it's Supergirl, it's not going to be as good. I actually liked the fact that they recognized that even the name Supergirl is dismissive, and that there's, a little reference to that in the film. So a lot of the criticism of Supergirl, it's just disingenuous sexism. That being said, it is not the greatest film in the history of film. It's not, in my top 10, right? It is a fun night at the movies. You should go see it. It's still fun, right? The other thing that it runs into is this issue that those of us who are nerds, who love comic book stuff, often fall into this kind of toxic fandom because we love our thing so much that when it finally breaks through, we're like, yay, there's going to be an Iron Man movie. I'm going to go see it. Oh, yay, there's going to be a new Star Wars movie. I'm going to go see it, whatever. And then we go see it and we're kind of inevitably disappointed. And that's because of our own expectations, because we bring this thing that we love. And so a lot of the, criticism you're going to read is going to come from people who say, I love comic books. I've heard folks, I'm a Marvel guy, but I've heard a lot of folks saying I'm a big DC person and I desperately want DC to kind of get it right. And it's so frustrating to me that they keep disappointing me. And, I want to be snide and say, but you paid for a ticket, right? I think that's budgeted in. They know a lot of folks are going to go to this because they love the property itself and they're going to be disappointed. And they could make the greatest movie in the world and you'd still go, but it's not quite the comic book that I love because it's a different medium, right? If you love a comic book and that's desperately what you want, I promise when you're in a dark movie theater, you're not reading a comic book, right? You are seeing it in a different way. And, bear that in mind. This is going to be distinct from the thing that you like. Another kind of disingenuous criticism comes from folks who are just frustrated that there are so many comic book movies. And I recognize that, but I want to speak to those folks and say, you need to understand something about the way that films are made and why that is changing. The fact that there are, it's going to incline Hollywood to make a lot more comic book movies. And part of that is budget. You make a movie that has if it requires $200 million to make, you need to make something that's going to bring in a lot of money, right? And these movies make a lot of money. But why comic books in particular? I think the antipathy really comes from people who are tired of superhero stories. And I get that. There is, a limit to the number of superhero stories. But we're conflating two different things. There's superheroes and there's comic books. And you can tell a comic book or a graphic novel story that is not about superheroes. And one of the reasons that Hollywood keeps going back to comic books is not just because they're infatuated with superheroes. It actually has to do with the way movies are made. So it used to be that somebody would write up a script, right? This was, typed, right? This was just a document with text on it. And then the director, in their own mind, would say, here's the shot that I want to use to depict this. And for financial reasons, that became kind of, it's not that it's untenable. There are still directors who make movies that way, but there's a lot more planning that has to go into making a film than there was in the 1940s. Because that one day of filming now costs $60, $70, $80,000 for a day, right? Because you're saying, okay, we're going to, literally put down tracks and we're going to have the camera on tracks, or we're going to be hiring a firm that's going to produce this CGI and they need this months in advance so that they can do all that animation. And so in an effort to do that, you don't just go, here's the script and here's the vision that's in the director's mind. The director may share with an artist what they want, or in some cases, George Romero's, a good example of this, he himself creates a storyboard. A storyboard, if you ever get a chance to see one, is a comic book, right? It is structured like that, where they're saying, this is the shot that I want, this is where I want this person, this is how I want them framed, right? So if you're Hollywood, and you're looking at, okay, we're going to make this big movie, you don't just want a script. And I say this as a writer, right, of novels, right? There was a time in the 90s when you'd write a novel and Hollywood was just buying them up, the options for them. And they were saying, okay, we want to have, we want to lock this thing down because this novel is what we're going to use to then make this film. That era has ended, right? They're not, nobody's calling me to say, hey, we want to make your novel into a film. Instead, what they're saying is, okay, we'll start with a screenplay. And even then, screenwriters will tell you, most of those screenplays never get made, right? The screenwriters are actually writing screenplays to get on the radar of somebody in Hollywood who's going to say, you're a really good writer. We're going to put you in a writer's room on the next film, not the one you just wrote, a different one entirely, right? And then maybe 30 years down the road, once they have worked their way to head writer and then maybe assistant director and director, they get to go, that script that I wrote when I was 17, I really want to actually make that film out of my script. That's sometimes why we get these films that are made by older directors but seem really juvenile. It's because that's how long it took to finally get to be in a place where they could make their own script into a major motion picture. Most of the time, screenwriters aren't getting to decide, this is the way this film is going to be made, right? People with the big money are saying, hey, we got the rights to, the board game Battleship and go write a script for that, right? It's backwards, right? But Hollywood is even moving away from the script is the thing to the storyboard is the thing, right? That's the planning document. So yeah, by all means, go ahead, write your script. But it used to be, hey, we're not going to option your novel. And then it was, hey, we're going to option the screenplay, but it'd be really handy for us if you had a storyboard. Well, think about the advantage of a comic book, right? The storyboard is done, or at least is already informing that director about, here's one way I could potentially frame this. So if you're looking at what movie am I going to be making next, having something that is presented to you essentially in storyboard form is far more likely to make you go, oh, okay, that's cool. Like if I was right now saying I want to get a movie made, I would say, okay, I've got a novel and now I'm going to write a screenplay. And, if I really want to get a leg up, I want to have a storyboard. That would be really cool in that pitch, right? To say, this is what it's actually going to look like. Comic books have that advantage. Now, does that then artificially inflate the number of superhero stories because comic books tend to be about superheroes? Yeah, I think that's probably a factor, right? And so there are folks out there who are saying, I am very tired of superhero stories. Understand the industry is leaning toward those because of the way the movies are made themselves. So when you knock out the people who are not liking Supergirl because of misogyny, and you knock out the people who are not liking it because they're going, oh, it's just another superhero movie, then you're left with people who are at least coming into that film in good faith, right? How does this thing stack up? And the biggest criticism I've heard, and again, I'm going to try and avoid spoilers, but there'll be a little bit of spoiler here, is that the villain is underdeveloped, right? And I think that's legit, but underdeveloped can often be a choice. Like, do you want to provide a character who tells you all of their motivations and we can relate to them? That's one way to go. Or you can say, I'm going to provide you with a character who's something of a cipher, and you can then imbue that character yourself as a viewer with motivations, with a kind of inner world. And that's a choice. And sometimes one works better and sometimes the other works better. And I think it's legit if folks are saying, I didn't like that this character was not particularly well developed, because what they're saying is, I couldn't imbue that character with much that made, I mean, there's not a lot of redemptive quality possible for this character. But the motivation, I think, is worth thinking about in terms of its connection to Disclosure Day. So let's step back. Disclosure Day is about this corporation that has been keeping the secret from the public, and they are, they're profiting on it. They are gaining power from it. And we have a character who is saying, I am going to reveal this big secret. So let's set that one here, right? Supergirl is really about, creating this character, letting us get to know her, developing her character so that she can be, important in other films. But when they're trying to let us get to know her, one of the things they do that is cool, and I think that Hollywood has learned, is you don't have to do the chronological start from birth, here's their story of how they gained their superpowers. We've seen that done a billion times. Instead, let's situate the character in a present, when they are in a situation where they need to grow out of. And so our character starts off in this kind of malaise, to go back to that word, right? She's in this place where she doesn't feel like she has a lot of purpose, right? And she needs to find purpose and grow into the hero that they're going to want her to be for future films, right? So what's going to be that crisis moment? So she's introduced to this other character. Again, maybe if this is spoilery for you, I get it, but I'm going to try not, I won't give away the ending. Although it's pretty predictable, right? Which is not, again, not bad that it is predictable. Stories can follow tropes, and we love them, right? The hero's journey, right? So it's okay. They're doing different things with that within a frame, right? But in her particular case, she is met by this character who needs her to, help her because she's on the other character, the younger character, is on a revenge quest, and our protagonist, Supergirl, is then going out and kind of reluctantly helping this character track down this guy. In fact, she really does not want to, but then she's, captured by the guy and then almost forced into a confrontation with him, and then by the end decides to be the person who kind of saves the day. So, Disclosure Day, hey, can we reveal this big secret? Supergirl, it's important to recognize what makes the villainous characters villainous. At the beginning, they are thieves, right? And murderers. And universal, right? 10 Commandments. Every religion, we can all say, okay, killing people, stealing from people, bad, right? But the thing that's really interesting is when Supergirl and the young woman that she is working with, get to this planet, they find that the criminal enterprise that these guys are engaged in is kidnapping all the girls and women on this particular planet to take them for breeding purposes. Now, again, super gross, maybe they just chose that at random, right? Because just like, theft and murder, universally accepted that that's really awful behavior, right? But again, presume intentionality. And what does that say about the zeitgeist? The thing I want you to consider when you consider both of these films in conjunction is we are living in the era of Epstein. That's the kind of magic word to me. The reason I was so excited to go see Disclosure Day was I was wondering, is this an Epstein metaphor? Now, not Epstein specifically, right? Not maybe that particular criminal enterprise. But bear in mind, Steven Spielberg works in Hollywood, and Hollywood just had a whole Harvey Weinstein scandal, right? He is well aware of this kind of larger situation going on of powerful men profiting from horrible things that they are doing to women. And he tells a story about a secret group that is profiting from their secret and deeply afraid that if the secret were to come out, it would change everything. And then we get this story of Kara in Supergirl, who is trying to defend this young woman from a group of men who are going around kidnapping all of the women on this planet to use them for breeding purposes. These are both speaking to our era and saying maybe different things or coming at them from different angles, but they're speaking about the same thing. We are living in a time where, unlike the 1976 Close Encounters of the Third Kind, where the zeitgeist was malaise, we are living in an era where we are desperate for accountability for these predatory men. Predatory men who are profiting off of secrets, right? They get to, if they can just keep the secret, and the secret is their predatory acts towards women, in the Supergirl case, and it's, big tech in the case of Disclosure Day. We live in an era where those two things are connected, right? The very same dudes who were going to Epstein Island were politicians and tech bros, right? These incredibly powerful billionaire types who were able to say, and they will say, like you have seen where they have come right out and said, we can't reveal all of the names because the whole global government would fall apart. Disclosure Day, everything would fall apart, right? If we just revealed how many of these men were involved in what appears to me, the more I read about it, a scandal that was very intentionally put together to be a blackmail scandal, right? Our blackmail system, right? Let's, get all these guys, on video doing the most horrible things they want to do, right? And then we have this incredible power over them, which means there's crimes and crimes and crimes, right? Because there's the crimes that they were committing that were being filmed, and then there's all the crimes they then were trying to keep covered up so that they wouldn't have this, blackmail revealed. And the covering up is another crime, right? So blackmail scandal, crimes that they were being pushed to commit, secrets that they were being pushed to keep, to cover up for the horrific crimes that they also had committed, right? This is layers of disgusting grossness, right? But I think it's worth noting when you are seeing Disclosure Day and Supergirl, I'm not saying it's these films are the same quality as Oppenheimer or Barbie, right? But see them in conjunction through that lens. What are they saying about us and about our desperate desire for accountability in an era of men being awful and men in power using that power to do whatever they want to, specifically to young women? These are a pair of Epstein movies. See them that way, and I think you'll come away saying, maybe the movies are, not the greatest films in the history of film, but what they are telling us is valuable and is worth thinking more about what they tell us about us. Consider.